A visibly nervous 73-year-old man arrived at the hospital with what medical staff originally assumed was his daughter. But as doctors examined the girl, they were silently horrified. The girl looked old enough to be the older man's wife instead of his daughter. Her skin was nearly void of color, and the few teeth she had remaining were rotten and barely hanging on. Their horror was magnified when they learned the girl was actually his granddaughter and that she was just 19 years old. But the shock that the medical staff and police felt at that point would pale in comparison to what they would soon learn were the circumstances that led to what they were seeing. In the words of the victim, "No one is going to believe me." Welcome back to Crime A to Z, where we detail cases and criminals from their very beginning until well after other reporting ends. After 24 years of captivity, over 3,000 rapes, and 7 children fathered, today we're talking about one of the most infamous kidnappings in history, involving one of the longest times spent in captivity. There have been cases of children being kidnapped and stowed away in secret basements before, but the planning and extensiveness of this case is exceptionally disturbing. Josef Fritzl was an only child. He was born on April 9, 1935 in Amstetten, Lower Austria, to parents, Maria and Josef Fritzl Sr. Fritzl Sr. was a severe alcoholic who abandoned Maria and Josef when Josef was just 4 years old, leaving him to be raised alone by his mother. Fritzl Sr. ultimately died in battle during World War II, fighting for the unified armed forces of Nazi Germany. His name appears on a memorial plaque in Amstetten. In 1956, 21-year-old Josef Fritzl married 17-year-old Rosemary. At the time, Josef was a well-known and respected electrical engineer. In 1967, just over 10 years after the couple had been married, Josef's deviant behavior began to come to light. Josef broke into the home of a 24-year-old nurse and raped her at knife point. He was arrested and served 12 months of his 18-month prison sentence before being released. Josef was also named as a suspect in the attempted rape of a 21-year-old and also had a history of indecent exposure. Despite the conviction and his history, Josef and Rosemary's marriage continued. They would go on to have 7 children together, 3 sons and 4 daughters. In 1966, Josef and Rosemary welcomed their 4th child, Elisabeth, having had 2 other daughters and 1 son before her. Elisabeth's childhood was a struggle, to say the least. Josef's toxicity permeated their day-to-day lives, with he and Elisabeth getting into frequent arguments that would result in her getting beaten. The beatings were not exclusive to Elisabeth, as Josef was abusive to his wife and all of his children. Elisabeth received the majority of the beatings because she was one of the only ones willing to stand up to her authoritarian father. Aside from Josef being physically abusive toward her and her siblings, he also began sexually abusing Elisabeth from the time she was 11 years old. After completing her government-required education at age 15, Elisabeth began a course to become a waitress. But before she finished, she decided she'd suffered enough of the abuse she was receiving at home, and in January 1983, she and a friend from work ran away from home to Vienna. Police found her within 3 weeks and returned her to her parents. Upon her return, she continued the course she was taking to become a waitress, and was ultimately offered a job in the nearby city, Linz. Elisabeth thought her life was finally about to change for the better. Unfortunately, nothing could be further from the truth. Knowing that Elisabeth would soon be bound for Linz and completely out of his control, it was time for Josef to execute his long-awaited plan. On August 28, 1984, shortly after Elisabeth turned 18, Josef lured her into the basement of the family home by lying and telling her he needed help carrying a door. In reality, for the last 6 years, Josef had been building what he told his family was an underground fallout shelter. While some might think this to be a bit suspicious, the Cold War between the United States and the USSR was raging on, and the lingering threat of nuclear warfare was always looming. So building a nuclear fallout shelter in your house was not uncommon. But Josef was not building a fallout shelter. The shelter was simply his cover story. On that August night, Elisabeth was about to find out what he was really building when she helped her father secure the final door to the area. She held the door in place while he attempted to secure it, shortly before slamming it in her face and knocking her backward into the shelter, or more accurately, the prison. He ran in with an ether-soaked towel, covered her mouth, and waited for her to fall unconscious. This would be the beginning of her new life, a life of living separate from society, barely kept alive by her captor father. The prison was a cramped, but cleverly planned room hidden behind a small square entrance that featured an elaborate keypad lock that Josef guaranteed only he could operate. On top of that, even getting to the final entry door of the room required getting past, not 1, not 2, but 8 locked doors within the elaborate labyrinth that Josef had meticulously planned and built. Upon Elisabeth's disappearance, Josef and Rosemarie reported their missing daughter to the police. Josef told the police she had run away to join a cult, and that he suspected this was coming when he noticed her growing interest in the occult. However, he was the only one that seemed to think Elisabeth had any interest in cults, as Rosemarie and other family members saw no such signs. However, police did confirm the previous report where Elisabeth had run away with her co-worker, and because of this, they suspected she had indeed simply run away again. The theory was backed by a letter from Elisabeth, which Josef forced Elisabeth to write, where she explained that she was tired of living with her family and warned her parents to not look for her or else she'd leave the country. The letter was the final piece that convinced the police that Elisabeth left voluntarily. So, they closed the case. Meanwhile, Josef visited Elisabeth in the underground prison almost daily to bring her food and other supplies. Beginning on her second day of captivity, he also visited almost daily to rape her, sometimes several times per day. Later, Josef would admit that he distanced himself from what he was doing by never looking Elisabeth in the face when he raped her. After 5 years of Elisabeth living alone in the prison, during which time Josef would hardly ever even speak to her, the babies started to come. At first, having a baby in the cellar with her was terrifying for Elisabeth. But they also provided much-needed company for her, as well as a purpose for living after so many years where she'd contemplated suicide. Over her 24 years of captivity, Elisabeth gave birth to 7 children by her father. For reasons still unclear, 3 of those children were chosen by Josef to live openly upstairs with him, his wife, and the rest of the family. Josef achieved this by placing all 3 of the children on the family porch at different points, along with more letters he'd forced Elisabeth to write. In the letters, she'd state that she was dropping the children off for her parents to take care of, because she couldn't handle the responsibility. Of the 4 children relegated to live with Elisabeth in the basement, one of them was born with respiratory issues and he died shortly after birth. The other 3, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, remained in the dungeon with Elisabeth. Elisabeth was refused medical attention and was forced to give birth to all 7 children in the basement without any medical assistance. To prepare for them, Josef provided Elisabeth with disinfectant, a dirty pair of scissors, and a book on childbirth from the 1960s. When Michael, the child with respiratory issues, died, Josef cremated his body in their oven. Social workers were called to their residence on multiple occasions, considering the way the children were all supposedly left at the door, and Josef convinced them all of his story. There were, however, several indications that something was awry. When the second child was left on the Fritzl's doorstep, it was Rosemarie Fritzl who discovered the child. She reported to a social worker that just before midnight she heard a baby crying outside the door. She opened the door to find the child laying there in a baby carriage. Just then the phone rang. She answered it, and someone claiming to be Elisabeth was apologizing for leaving her child on their doorstep. Rosemary immediately recognized that the call was a recording and not a live person, so she hung up. But the phone rang again immediately. When she answered the second time, the same message was replayed. In addition to the recording being a concern, Rosemary also noted to the social worker that she found the call odd since they had recently changed their home phone number and no one should have known the new number at that point. In hindsight, others also noticed signs. Josef's sister-in-law reported that he would go into the basement every morning at 9 a.m., explaining that he was making blueprints and building new machines to sell to clients. But he warned that no one was ever to bother him or come down into the basement while he was working. The Fritzls also rented out a bedroom in their home, which happened to be directly above the basement. One of the tenants reported he would hear noises at night and would bring his concerns to Josef. But Josef would always assure him it was nothing more than faulty pipes and house-settling noises. Another tenant who lived there over a 4-year period noted that his dog would randomly become alert in the middle of the night, sniffing and growling at seemingly nothing. The tenant would look around the house to find whatever his dog was suspicious of, but never found the cellar door or anything of concern. But neither his wife, his family, nor any of the multitude of tenants over the years harbored enough suspicion to report any of Josef's peculiar actions. Even as he spent more and more time in the basement, was living in a separate area of the home, apart from his wife, and would often spend the night in the basement, claiming that he was actually away on business trips. Tenants even noticed him bring bags of groceries, building materials, appliances, and furniture into the basement, but still didn't arouse enough suspicion to report anything. Despite the unfortunate circumstances surrounding the births of her children, Elisabeth loved and cared for the 3 children that lived with her as well as she could. Investigators and reporters expressed how impressed and inspired they were by how well Elisabeth managed to raise her kids considering their circumstances. Elisabeth requested that Josef bring her books regularly so she could teach the children to read and write, and she made sure they learned about the outside world and its culture through the television and radio that Josef allowed them to keep downstairs. In 1994, after Elisabeth gave birth to a 4th child, Josef allowed the cramped 380-square-foot prison to be extended to 590 square feet, or just over 50% larger. Once the concealed prison was expanded, it would contain a narrow 16-foot corridor, a storage area, 3 small open cells connected by narrow passageways, 2 sleeping areas equipped with 2 beds each, bathroom facilities, and a basic cooking area. The ceilings were so low they only reached between 5 feet 6 inches in some areas, up to 6 feet at their highest point, a condition that would cause walking problems for Stefan, who ultimately grew to 5 feet 8 inches but would have to stoop to walk nearly all the time. To achieve the extension, Josef forced the underground family to dig the walls with their bare hands. He warned them that touching the inside of the cellar door he came down from would electrocute them, and that if they ever tried to escape, they would instantly be gassed. While police confirmed that there was no gas supply to the basement, and that this was likely a threat to scare the family, Josef punished them in other ways for even the smallest acts of disobedience. On top of the repeated physical and sexual abuse, as punishment, he would shut down all the power to the cellar or refuse to bring any food or water, forcing Elisabeth, and later her children, to live hungry, thirsty, and in total darkness, for days at a time. On the 19th of April in 2008, the hellish prison would only be the home of Elisabeth and her 3 kids for 1 more week. On that day, 19-year-old Kirsten, one of Elisabeth's 3 children still with her at the time, fell unconscious. For the first time ever, Josef heeded to Elisabeth's request that medical attention was necessary. So, he allowed Elisabeth outside to help him carry Kirsten to the car. It was the first time she'd seen the outside world in 24 years. Once Kirsten was in the car, Josef locked Elisabeth back with the other children in the dungeon, then proceeded to the local hospital. Upon arriving at the hospital, doctors were immediately concerned, as Kirsten's skin was as white as a ghost. It was so white you could easily see her veins, and some noted that it was nearly transparent. Obviously confused by this, the doctors asked Josef for the girl's name to look up her and her family's medical history. But to their surprise, Kirsten's name was nowhere to be found in the database. She seemingly didn't exist before now. Upon examination, doctors found that Kirsten was in serious condition, suffering from life-threatening kidney failure on top of several other medical issues brought on by a vitamin D deficiency. Josef frantically told the doctors that Kirsten was one of his granddaughters. Her even younger than previously assumed age heightened doctors' concern even more, and they insisted to Josef that they get in contact with the mother so they could figure out what was going on. The doctors were growing increasingly suspicious of and irritated by Josef, as he refused to answer almost all important questions or simply danced around them. As their suspicions about Josef's story mounted, they decided to alert the police on April 21st. In an attempt to contact Elisabeth, the police broadcast a public appeal for her to come forward to provide Kirsten's medical history. They reopened the file on Elisabeth's disappearance from years prior. Josef stuck with his story that Elisabeth had run away with a cult and even produced yet another letter that he'd forced her to write, from January of that year, which was postmarked in the town of Captivity. Police contacted an expert on cults who was highly suspicious of both the seemingly dictated and oddly written letter, as well as the supposed cult, which he felt didn't exist. In the meantime, Elisabeth begged Josef to allow her to go to the hospital. A week later, on April 26th, Josef allowed Elisabeth to come with him to the hospital, with strict instructions for her to stick to the fabricated story, or face the consequences. He also allowed the two remaining children to be taken to the upstairs home while they went to the hospital. When they arrived at the hospital, Josef and Elisabeth were immediately detained by police and separated for questioning. Elisabeth was initially reluctant and fearful, talking very quietly and avoiding eye contact. The doctors and authorities' first suspicion was that Elisabeth was an abusive mother, and that her treatment and neglect of her daughter was the cause of Kirsten's health issues. But they quickly began questioning that theory once they saw that Elisabeth shared the same ghostly features of white hair and pale, white skin. Elisabeth remained unwilling to cooperate until the police granted her her only request: that she never has to see her father again. Once police agreed, she told them everything. Over the next hours, she recounted her 24 years in captivity, including the secret dungeon, the constant physical and sexual abuse dating back even before her imprisonment, the multiple children, the fact that some of them were taken from her, and even unfathomable details like how he used to force her to watch adult films and then reenact them with him in front of their children to humiliate her and scar the children. Police forced Josef to give them the key code to his electrical lock and immediately began investigating the home and basement. On the same night he and Elisabeth came to the hospital, Josef, 73 years old at the time, was arrested and taken into custody. 3 days later, on April 29th, DNA evidence confirmed that Elisabeth was telling the truth and that all 6 of Elisabeth's remaining kids were biologically Josef's. Police also planned to interview every person that had rented the extra bedroom in the house, with the number of former tenants totaling over 100. During the investigation, police found the many letters that Josef forced Elisabeth to write, one of which seemingly implied that he was planning on releasing her from the basement the following year. The letter stated that she wanted to come home, but that it wasn't possible for her to do so just yet. Police believed, and Josef confirmed, that his plan was to free her, but tell everyone in the outside world that he had actually rescued her from the cult she had run away to. He felt he was growing too old to care for his second family underground and was hatching what he felt was a viable transition plan. Once police began interrogating Josef, he confessed to everything. He claimed that he simply lived a second life in the basement with his daughter, and that while he may have been forcing her to stay in the basement, the details of their relationship were all consensual. He claimed that the media painted him out to be a monster, but that in reality, he and his second family enjoyed spending time together, and he had a good relationship with Elisabeth and their kids. Despite these false claims, he does admit that something in him was aware that everything he was doing was wrong, but he became so used to his secondary life underground that he didn't care. He acknowledged that what prompted him to keep Elisabeth locked up in the basement is that she no longer adhered to any rules in her teenage years, and that he needed to keep her safe from the outside world, by force if he thought necessary. But even though he made statements like that, positioning himself as her protector, he'd also make statements that reflected quite the opposite. He admitted that the decades without sunshine, or medical and dental care, caused a profoundly negative effect on his daughter's health, stating, "Elisabeth remains strong, she never complains, even as her teeth slowly rot and come out of her mouth, one by one. She suffers day and night with unbearable pain and can't sleep." By the time Elisabeth had arrived at the hospital that fateful day, each and every one of her teeth had excruciatingly rotted out of her mouth. Josef admitted that the reason he wanted to force Elisabeth into carrying all of these children is because of his obsession with being in control. He wanted to own Elisabeth like a piece of property, and made sure that he could do so in every way possible. On the off chance she escaped his dungeon of horrors, he was hoping he could get her pregnant as many times as possible, so future partners would be scared off by the large number of children she had, and she'd hopefully be led back to him out of desperation. During Josef's prison stint for his earlier rape conviction, he admitted that he planned to lock his daughter up so that he could contain and express his evil side. After his arrest, analysts reported that he stated, "I was born to rape, and I held myself back for a relatively long time. I could have behaved a lot worse than locking up my daughter." Analysts surmised that Josef's deviant behavior was likely fueled by his upbringing by a toxic mother and father who abandoned them. While Josef used to speak very highly of his mother, he eventually came to share the truth, which is that she hated him, abused him, beat him until he was laying in a pile of his own blood, and even compared him to Satan. Despite his fear of his mother, he actually let her move into the house with him and Rosemary back in 1959. But at that time, the roles became reversed, and his mom was facing Josef's abusive personality on a daily basis. This all culminated in Josef locking her up in the attic and telling everyone that she had died all the way up until she actually did. Police now think that he could have held his mom prisoner for about 20 years before dying in his captivity. To adhere to the agreement that Elisabeth would never have to see her father again, she gave videotaped testimony presented to Austrian prosecutors and investigators in July 2008. Later that month, the trial for Josef began. He faced 10 years for the negligent homicide charge of Michael, the infant who died shortly after birth, as well as a maximum of 20 years for rape, incest, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and enslavement. On the first day of the trial, Josef pleaded guilty to all charges except for the negligent homicide and grievous assault, brought on by threatening to gas his captives if they disobeyed him. His defense attorney encouraged the jury to not be swayed by their emotions and insisted his client was not a monster, citing that he'd brought a Christmas tree down to his captives during the holidays. The prosecution pressed for life imprisonment in an institution for the criminally insane. She demonstrated with markings on the wall how low the height of the ceiling in the dungeon was, as well as how damp and moldy it was, passing around musty objects from the cellar, causing the jurors to flinch from the odor. Jurors watched nearly 11 hours of taped testimony from Elisabeth in total, broken down into 2-hour sessions. Because the details were so harrowing, they couldn't bear more than 2 hours of the testimony at a time. Elisabeth's brother also testified about Josef's abuse, but his wife Rosemary and the other children from the cellar refused to testify. Elisabeth attended day 2 of the trial. She'd actually attended in disguise the day prior in preparation for a book she planned to write about her ordeal. But on this second day of the trial, Josef recognized that she was in court. Josef and Elisabeth's eyes met, and Josef went pale and broke down. The following day of the trial, he immediately approached the judge and changed his plea to guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility for parole after 15 years. He accepted the sentence and stated he would not appeal. Once the trial was over, Elisabeth and her 6 children were given new identities and a new home where they could enjoy their freedom, but still be afforded privacy. All of the 6 children require ongoing therapy. The upstairs children had been traumatized by both Josef's abuse as well as learning that he'd lied to them about their mother abandoning them. And the downstairs children dealt with the obvious trauma of being deprived of normal development, fresh air and sunshine, as well as the extreme mental, physical, and sexual abuse they received or witnessed by Josef. Additionally, all 6 children may face genetic issues inherent to children born of an incestuous relationship. Elisabeth allows her 3 children who grew up in Josef and Rosemary's house to visit their grandmother regularly. Elisabeth is said to have been estranged from her mother for believing her father's story about her whereabouts and not questioning it. However, over time, she came to forgive her mother and they have a strong relationship now. In 2013, work began to fill the basement of the old Fritzl home with concrete. The home would ultimately sell 3 years later to buyers who turned the building into apartments. Josef Fritzl was remanded to a special prison unit for the criminally insane in Austria's Kremstein prison, where he is to serve out his sentence. In May 2017, Josef Fritzl changed his name to Josef Mehrhoff. Unconfirmed reports claim it was due to fights in prison, one of which resulted in several of his teeth getting knocked out. A British journalist, Mark Perry, interviewed Fritzl in his prison cell and reported that he has shown no remorse for his crimes. He quoted Josef as saying, "Just look into the cellars of other people, you might find other families and girls down there." In April 2019, Josef's health was said to be declining. He's suffering from dementia, and he doesn't want to live anymore. It's also reported that he is withdrawn, doesn't want anything to do with his fellow inmates, and likewise, they don't want anything to do with Austria's most infamous convict. In 2021, a regional court ordered the 87-year-old Fritzl to an alternative penitentiary, essentially moving him from a psychiatric prison to a standard prison. That decision was based on a psychiatric report that stated he no longer posed any danger. However, a higher regional court in Vienna ruled that there were no convincing indications that Fritzl was no longer a danger and therefore must remain in a secure psychiatric facility. Had Fritzl been moved out of the psychiatric prison, he would be eligible to apply for parole after having served 15 years, which is scheduled to occur in 2023. So as of the making of this video in 2023, Fritzl remains in a psychiatric prison where he remains ineligible for parole. Thank you so much for watching. We hope this video did justice to Elisabeth and all her precious children. We can only imagine the amount of fortitude and courage it must have taken to stand up to and speak out against a force that had so brutally ruled over every aspect of her life for 24 years. Her strength is an inspiration. What are your thoughts about this disturbing case? Do you feel Josef's sentence was long enough? Many expressed that it should have been at least as long as he'd held his daughter and family captive. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to see more videos like this one, please be sure to hit like, and definitely hit subscribe so you never miss a single video.